Thank you very much. Yes, I think before we turn to taking questions from the audience, we have a few things to discuss at the table. And to begin with, since Professor Dreyfus was brave enough to present himself as a target, I'd like to give him an opportunity to respond to some of the comments that we've heard from the others.
I'm tempting to take down the jacket and start the debate, but I will refrain from that. Thank you for these wonderful responses, which I think span over a whole range of issues. Obviously, I think there is a real difference that I want to make about Dharmakirti as he was in his context and how we can take him to me. And I want to make this distinction quite clear. In my paper, I try to remain quite closely, to stick quite closely to what Dharmakirti said in his own context. And therefore, your point about, Susan's point about the resemblance, the conflict in a way between or the tension between the resemblance theory and the importance of conceptual schema, I think is exactly to the point. In fact, Dharmakirti has a view that there is a similarity between the Akara and the external world, but that view actually gets questioned in Dharmakirti's own works. And so I think if I were to take, when he goes Yogacara and so on, and so when, if I were to take Dharmakirti in a kind of modern context, I would definitely agree with Susan and say we don't really need resemblance theory. We do need a theory of representation and an understanding of how representation articulates with a conceptual schema. And so that's a view which I think Dharmakirti is a way pointing to, because I think Dharmakirti has a different understanding that what is given to the senses than, for example, Locke or other British empiricists. So this is my first remark. One thing that one of the inconvenience of trying to summarize my paper is I left plenty of things out. And one of the things I left out is the issue that Ned raised, which is the question of the content of the consciousness and how we become aware of that content. And on that, Dharmakirti has a very clear view, which I summarize in my paper, but which is that awareness is inherently reflexive. And by reflexivity here, I do not mean reflectivity. That is for Dharmakirti, and here this is where the Dharmakirtian Buddhist and the Nyayika, in a way, part view. For Dharmakirti, the reflexivity is not due to a thought process, but there is a direct element of awareness in the cognitive process, which for Dharmakirti would be probably present in mice, dogs, and cats, and which is clearly, which is a basis for reflectivity, that is the thought process, which then takes representation as its object. So Dharmakirti has a very, very clear doctrine on that, which is that every perception is reflexive. And this is what he means by self-cognition. Self-cognition, there is a big debate on this topic in India, obviously, and Stephen has brought out very eloquently the Nyaya side. And for Dharmakirti, self-cognition is not a separate cognition. It's not a reflection on the representation. It's right. It's an inherent part of every mental state. Okay, so these are some of the points I wanted to make. Also, I think Susan's point about the role of language, I think, is in the present context extremely important and well taken. I think as far as Dharmakirti and the Buddhist tradition, I do not think that there is any elaborate discussion of whether all concepts are linguistic or not. I think their views, as you have characterized it rightly, is a nominalistic view, and therefore it is committed to the idea that natural types are a production of our interaction with the world rather than existing out there. How this interaction is parsed, obviously, is something else, and I think Dharmakirtian philosophy has a great deal to learn, or is quite interested in this dialogue with cognitive scientists and philosophers, because indeed there is a lot more to be learned about how what's the role of language and what is pre-linguistic. And so I think your analysis really helps here. Finally, as far as Stephen Phillips' content, I thank him very much for his paper. I'm obviously tempted to engage into fierce debate, but I will not do that. I think it is important that you brought out a really important point, which is the danger of a dialogue like this one is to kind of reify and isolate Buddhist thought as being this kind of, number one, like the best thing that India produced, or this kind of monolithic entity that is supposed to be. And obviously it's not like this. The Buddhists were part of a very lively philosophical dialogue, and Stephen brought out very well some of the issues. It's clear that there is a very deep opposition which is running between both sides, and maybe a little bit of bad blood. So in fact, I'm not aware that there is actual violence, but there is extraordinarily virulent controversy of an Indian tradition is represented as this wonderful ecumenical tradition. It's true that as far as we know, people didn't seem to fight, but they were quite at each other's throat, at least in a metaphorical sense of the word. And so there is this very vigorous debate opposing a realist tradition like the Nyaya and the Buddhists, which I think you have aptly characterized as nominalistic. And for example, one of the very interesting issues that you bring in is precisely this, the question of Savikalpika Pratyaksha, whether perception is, as Dharmakirti argued, just a kind of bare sensing, or whether there is already a great deal of articulation which is happening at the perceptual level itself. And I think that's a very lively issue as far as I'm concerned. I could describe myself as a modern Dharmakirtian. So that's, at least in this context here. So that's, I think, what I wanted to say. And thank my co-panelists for this very thoughtful remarks.
I want to ask a question to Stephen Phillips, so just to make sure I understand this. So in your item 2, you say that according to the Nyaya, sometimes we're totally absorbed in objects having no awareness of our own consciousness. So I take it that the Nyaya disagree with Dharmakirti. Absolutely. We were just told Dharmakirti's view is that awareness of an experiential state is an intrinsic part of it. So the Nyaya disagree with that.
Absolutely. Though we can become in apperception aware, but that's a separate act. Creativity.
We're willing to bite the bullet and say, we don't need any mechanism. There is no reason to have a mechanism. It's just causal, period. You don't need to talk about the psychological mechanism. So some Buddhists were quite willing to say, to bite the bullet and say, look, you're right, we don't have mechanisms because we don't deal mechanisms. All what we need is a process of cause and effect, which is vastly more complicated than what the human mind can comprehend in its totality. And that's what we are happy to sit with. I mean, all Abhidharma traditions, I mean, this is Chandrakirti, who is a Madhyamika and certainly cannot be accused to be an Abhidharmist. All of the Abhidharma traditions have attempted to provide various answers to this question. In fact, that's one of the crucial point on which they disagree. Some, in the Sarvastivada Abhidharma, we have notion like prapti, which is supposed to be like death recognition, which is contained by the stream of consciousness. I think in the Tibetan tradition, the answers which has been most favored is a kind of Yogacara or post-Yogacara answer, which argues that the mind existed there is two levels of the mind. There is this operative mind, level of the mind in which the mind engages with the external world, and then, or with itself, with thought, and then there is this kind of subliminal level of the mind, this basic level of the mind, which the Yogacharan called alai vijnana, store consciousness, and that's where the kind of continuum that would hold the memories and propensities that Stephen Phillips talked about. And I think the term samskara is indeed very, very important here, because it is a question of propensities and memories and so on. And so Vyalaya is really the Yogacharan answer. But it's an answer which is kind of congruent with the answer of most Abhidharma traditions.
Well, it seems to me that my prospects are slim of provoking fisticuffs directly on the dais, and we'll have a chance to attempt that at lunch among ourselves. So I think I'll turn to some questions from other people. Annabella, should I read the cards myself, or have the first one is actually from a panelist, Anne Klein, who I think is sitting in the corner, and congratulates us on a rich and coherent panel. Here's the question. Collectively, your discussions suggest we may be wrong in drawing too hard a line between perception, cognition, or subjective states and objective neurological phenomena. For Buddhists, as Professor Dreyfus has said, whether the akara, which I think you translate aspect, is in the subject or the object is a very difficult question. My own sense, and compare here the discussion of akara in Knowledge and Liberation, is that this difficulty, like the difficulty of clearly determining mind's relation to matter and so forth, is itself a very compelling feature of mind. That we will not be well aware of mind's properties without someone incorporating this mysterious or elusive element as a central property of consciousness itself. Please comment.
There's two distinctions here. There's the distinction between perception and cognition, and there's the distinction between representation and the thing represented. And those are really two separate issues. So, for sure, where I think we're all agreed, for the sake of amity on the panel, that we're not going to understand the mind without being able to think about the relationship between the mind and the external world, because that's what it is about minds, among other things. They represent the external world. And whether minds are material or immaterial, and how that works, that's a very hard question. And the answer given in cognitive science is actually very similar to the answer that, at least in Professor Dreyfus's exposition, that was given in 700 BC in this tradition. But the distinction between perception and cognition is a distinction among mental representations, right? And in this particular case, it was a very important theoretical distinction because of the epistemological work that perception did, and because perception was unmistaken and conception was mistaken. I mean, it did a lot of work, that distinction. So blurring that distinction or wondering whether those are the right natural kinds is a current research project in cognitive science. And that's a separate issue from the much hairier one, which is the ontology of mental representations and how mental representations relate to the world. Maybe it's not as big a gap as the hard problem of consciousness, but the problem of how it's possible that we can be in a referential thing, referential relation in the world is a really hard problem that's, I don't think, easily has been solved.
Just a word on the perception-cognition distinction. What?
Perception.
Perception. Well, okay, so that makes the point I'm making rather obvious, which is that perception doesn't require any concepts. Cognition does require concepts. In fact, that's what we mean by a concept, is an element of thought. So it seems to me there's a very clear distinction between perception and cognition, namely the role of concepts in it.
For Dharmakirti, what I was talking is perception and conception, not perception and cognition. So let's be very clear on that. And you're right, there is a real issue whether you want to draw this sharp dichotomy that Dharmakirti does. But, and obviously I think here cognitive science is going to probably change the debate in providing a much richer analysis. When I read neuroscience, I'm told that there are about 25 brain centers which intervene in the process of vision, or 30 or something like this. And so it's clear that vision is a whole process of construction, and that whether you can really draw these sharp boundaries or not is going to be a question that could be amenable to interesting, and is going to probably to be amenable to interesting investigation. I think, however, from a kind of philosophical perspective, that distinction, I think, is defendable. So I think, yeah, that's why I would leave it there. I think the question of unmistakenness that Susan brought is more problematic. And I think, in fact, Dharmakirti, that's a part of Dharmakirti's work, that he kind of brushed to the side that some part of his work, because he hold in final analysis that perception is mistaken. But for the sake of simplicity, I think it is clear that this is a problematic issue, especially position, especially if you kind of move in the sense that I think is more interesting, which is to see how perception and our conceptual scheme are articulated to produce knowledge, at which point the constructive project become more interesting than the purely epistemological one.
Let me say that from the Nyaya perspective, and they would say that in philosophy the distinction is indefensible, since the point of mentioning perception is to justify a position. So when I say, this is my friend Professor Tubb, or even I recognize this is a piece of paper, that's a perception. I'm expressing a perceptual cognition, and it has the status of a valid bit of knowledge because it has been generated in the right way, and so it's not a defensible distinction at all. I recognize my friend. I recognize the piece of paper perceptually. Of course, concepts feed perception. It is savikalpika pratyaksha. Nevertheless, it's in the epistemological context. The whole point is to cite our evidence for our views, and we can't get beneath that. We start with such claims.
You really taunt me into taking off my jacket. This is great because, in Tibetan there is this proverb that tuna keva mean, only idiots agree. So it's good that we have disagreement. I think I would respond very briefly that for Dharmakirti, recognition is precisely conceptual. And this is why he makes this distinction. It's not the case that we recognize something perceptually. Rather, it is the case that you have a akara, which then you recognize as this and that. So recognition is clearly conceptual. It's not perceptual. And this is, in fact, where one of the issues may be. Yes. Yes.
I think that from the point of view of modern psychology, the distinction that you're after is called the distinction between sensation and on the one hand, and perception and cognition on the other. And I think that is a defensible distinction, that in computational terms, in sensations, there are no constancies. So they don't have the same degree of aboutness that both perceptions and perceptual representation, what we want to call perceptual representations and conceptual representations do. I myself do think that there is a distinction between perception and cognition that can be drawn, but it's a different one from that. But that's the whole point. The point is that if you take this enterprise seriously, you're trying to find the right distinctions among kinds of mental representations that are going to do some explanatory work in how the mind actually works. And it's very much a work in progress, and it will be constrained by cognitive neuroscience also.
We have not nearly enough time left to deal with all of the questions that have come in. I think what I'd like to try to do next, and we'll see if we have time left after this, is to read one question directed specifically to each of the four panelists, and I'll start with one more from an upcoming panelist, Edith, and this is for Professor Dreyfus on intentionality. Could intentionality, yes, could intentionality be understood in the manner of Western phenomenological philosophy, that is that of Husserl? Consciousness aims at its object, but he added the concept of bracketing, the putting out of play, whether the object exists or does not. A procedure that for him offers a truer representation of the object. In sum, cut out the existential claim, get to the object.
Okay, well, this is something I was afraid of, that Edith, who knows 100 times more about intentionality, would ask me a question. And so my fear had been realized. So let me say at the outset that I really don't know very well Husserl, and so I find it difficult to really engage, and I'm trying, in fact, to learn more about Husserl. You know, when professors want to learn something, they teach a course, and this is, at least that's what I do, and that's what I'm supposed to do next year. So ask me this question next year, I might have a much more articulate answers. I would think that, however, if we were to compare Dharmakirti and Husserl, that is, not talk in broad Dharmakirtian terms, but more specifically about what Dharmakirti had in mind. It remained the case that for Dharmakirti, his main project is epistemological, and is not, the phenomenology is only one part of the aspect. So to read Dharmakirti as a phenomenologist, I think, is actually to misunderstand what he's trying to do. Phenomenology is clearly there, as it is in many parts of the Buddhist tradition, but it's not what the goal, what the main project is about. I think the main project is clearly to talk about pramana, that is valid cognition of knowledge, and therefore in this context it remains an important issue of to which degree various forms of knowledge are grounded or are related, maybe to use a weaker term, are related to realities. And so I think what Susan was talking about, that is the degree to which various forms of cognition constrained and so on, I think is important and would be a kind of Dharmakirtian way to talk about, to take the conversation in a modern context, while still insisting that for this enterprise, the relation with the external world is still part of the project. So I think this is really a different approach, but I think I might do much better 1 year a year from now. Next,
question for Susan on input analyzers. I have a strong habit of seeing a strong distinction between cognition and perception. So my impulse was to see your discussion of input analyzers, etc., as a confusion of cognitive things with fundamental elements of perception. However, I get the feeling that you're asserting these things, that is, input analyzers, are essential to the process of perception and inseparable from it. Is that correct? Could you explain?
Yeah. The claim is that in these classes of representations, core knowledge, as I said, there's not an infinite number of domains of core knowledge. We know there's good evidence for core knowledge of objects and mechanical causality as part of that. There's good evidence for this one that I mentioned here, good evidence for core knowledge of number, and that's it, right? So it's not all of knowledge by any means. But what characterizes these systems of knowledge is that there are actual innate perceptual analyzers that take spatial, temporal, and sensory information and output representations that have the content something like goal, right? So it's not a confusion between them and perceptual representations. It's a claim that there are perceptual analyzers that output these representations. And what makes them have conceptual content then is their conceptual role and the fact that they don't look at all like sensory representations. So it's deliberately a middle architecture. And the idea is that for these domains, which are so evolutionarily important, Darwin or Mother Nature built perceptual analyzers that outputted representations into central cognitive systems with that content. And so we don't need to construct a representation of an agent through the kind of process that Dharmakirti is talking about, learning the concept of cow. We just don't have to. It's an empirical claim. And it is really, really important that that's not how most of cognition works, right? Most of cognition, there's a very deep inferential depth between what the output of our sensory analyzers are and the identification of the entities in the domain. I mean, take, for example, how we identify atoms, right? There's no innate input. These are really central ontological commitments that we have as human beings to there being agents in the world, to there being middle-sized objects in the world. And it's not an ontological claim that there really are such things, but that our minds are prepared to see them. We don't construct them through language and cultural construction. Darwin constructed them. And that's one natural kind of representations in the world. But by no means, that's not supposed to be a characteristic of most of our conceptual representations.
I think we'll try to complete our sweep of the table somewhat expeditiously with two more questions, and first one for Ned Block that will be difficult to answer briefly, I think, but we'll see what you can do. What would a concept be like which would be common to the subjective and objective? How would we come up with it? And if there are non-linguistic concepts, might we already have one but be unable to explicate it?
Quite what to say about that.
Perhaps you just can't explicate it.
I mean, look, what I meant by subjective concept and objective concept was such that there weren't any concepts that were both. I meant by a subjective concept, a concept that has an experiential element, like the concept of a state that feels like this. And by an objective one, I meant, for example, a scientific concept. Like a brain state concept, for example. So the idea was that these two different kinds of concepts on the physicalist point of view pick out the same thing. But I guess it would be, almost an item of definition that there aren't any concepts that are both. I wouldn't, maybe somebody can think of something, but nothing comes to mind offhand.
And the non-linguistic concept?
Well, I think that the subjective concepts can certainly be non-linguistic. It's hard to imagine a scientific concept that's non-linguistic.
For Steve Phillips, yes, go ahead. Sure.
Why don't you just use this one? Yeah. Here, just use this one. Here, this one.
It's just, I think, a direct follow-up, and I'll be very brief. The very nice way you put the sort of problem could be interpreted in two different ways. One is that there is a sort of objective conceptual problem between the objective concepts and the subjective concepts. Another one could be that we are so used to using those concepts in two different language games, which actually are part of a tradition which makes us think that they can't, as it were, bind or meet. So, I mean, for example, work you know, Colin McGinn says there'll never be a satisfying way of binding the objective with the subjective. But one might distinguish between a satisfying solution and a satisfactory solution. Where I have in mind by a satisfactory one, it is still puzzling that heat is mean molecular kinetic energy. And the gold has the atomic numbers. I mean, you know, but after a while, you learn to speak in both voices. So my idea here would be to give partly a social account of the problem.
In Oxford philosophy in the 60s, which was very oriented towards ordinary language, people would say things like, well, it just doesn't make any sense to say that water is H2O. It's just like the word water and the word H2O and together in the same sentence seems somehow objectionable. And I agree that just by getting used to it, it can seem less objectionable. But as Tom Nagel emphasized, the problem we have is understanding how a subjective concept can link back through however we think reference works, like causal chains or something, to the same thing that an objective concept links back to. And that's not a matter of getting used to it, that's really a matter of having a story of how that's supposed to work.
I think we can only manage to squeeze in one last question if Steve Phillips can answer it fairly quickly. The question you've all been waiting for. Why do you consider Arya Nagarjuna anti-intellectual? And a general comment that goes with that. Discussion of Buddhist assertions juxtaposed with Western views seems stifled by the absence of any description of the doctrine of the two truths. But this distinction is obviously needed to contextualize any Buddhist comments on science, and this need was obvious during Professor Flanagan's discussion of the Dalai Lama's science-centered meetings.
Well, Nagarjuna feels anti-intellectualist. As you probably know, there are within Buddhism two main interpretations of Nagarjuna, the Swatantrika and the Prasangika. The Prasanga means objection, and at least to his adversaries, Nagarjuna was much more famous for the objections, the challenges that he put forth to their metaphysical reasoning. Now, if you look at the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, as ably translated by J. Garfield, you'll see a lot of metaphysical arguments. And so, indeed, it seems to me that the Swatantrika reading, where Dharmakirti does put forth some reasoning in favor of his view, and indeed supports a two-truth position, where, and indeed within our world, that we need certain guides, intellectual guides, in order to bring our practices to their fulfillment is absolutely crucial. And so, yeah, I stand somewhat corrected. I was writing mainly from sort of a sense of the broader context of Indian philosophy, where Dharmakirti is much like Socrates. He challenges his opponent to come up with better arguments.
Thank you. I think we'll end this panel with that.